Shalom, shalom. This is Akodi Kasita. I just wanted to come and share with you guys a book that I'm currently reading. It's a very old, very well-known book. The author is Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. Maybe you guys have heard of her, maybe not. But if not, this is someone that I think you need to get to know, especially as a black person. Now, this book that Dr. Frances Cress Welsing wrote back in the late 70s is titled The ISIS Papers, The Keys to the Colors. And basically what Dr. Frances does in her book, she just goes deep into the so-called white race, Caucasians, and the system of racism and white supremacy. And what she feels started it, is the root of it, and what perpetuates it. And I gotta say, it gets pretty deep. It's pretty awesome. She makes some very, very serious claims, and they kind of make sense. So I would advise anyone, black or white, especially, if you're black. Well, I think white people should get this book as well. You should pick it up. You should try to get your hands on it and read it a little bit. It will definitely get your wheels turning if you're open to education. Dr. Francis believes, amongst other people, there are other people that believe this as well, but she states in her book specifically how she believes that the so-called white race or Caucasian people were actually sprung from a genetic mutation known as albinism. She believes that many years ago in Africa, black mothers began producing albino children. And without the science and technology that we have today, they didn't know what to think. So they abandoned these colorless children. Feeling outcasted and unwanted, these albinos eventually they begin to band together and form their own separate community. And due to their sensitivity to the sun, they eventually migrated towards what is now known today as Europe. There's a story on YouTube that popped up very recently about an African man and woman who actually, I believe they live in Europe now, but they gave birth to I think it was their third or their fourth child. And it was a little girl, and she came out with white skin. I mean, she looks just like a so-called white person. And their other three children are dark skinned. So it is possible for people of color to produce people without color. And so that's what Dr. Francis believes happened many years ago, ages ago. And, and she, like I said, she's not alone in her theology. Many other people believe this claim. They believe it to be possible and very true. I've even heard and glanced at what was supposed to be supportive evidence of this claim, such as documentation supposedly of the actual migration of the albinos from Africa to Europe. Okay, and so, many people try to say, well, I've heard people on YouTube and even face-to-face people will say, well, white Caucasian people and albinos are different, okay, because albinos have like bleached hair and are really, really pale and, have bad eyesight. Like, it's totally different. But if you look up the definition of albinism, it basically just means absence of color. That's what albinism is. It's a defective trait that affects, I can't think of the word right now, but it affects a chemical in your body which helps you produce melanin, and something's wrong with that chemical. So you don't have any color. And I've even read recently that a Caucasian or a so-called white person's skin is really no different to that of a person who's been diagnosed with albinism. It's been examined microscopically, I guess. Also, what a lot of people don't know, something I didn't know until recently, is that albinism is more than blonde hair and really pale skin. So far, what I've discovered is that albinism comes in 4 stages, and I can't remember them all, but I know the first stage of albinism, and they all have their certain names, and I can't, they're long, difficult words, but the first stage has to do primarily with the eyes. A person that has really poor eyesight. That's the first stage of albinism. The second stage of albinism has to do with the skin and hair. That's when a person will have like platinum hair and have vampire pale skin. They'll be very pale. Then the third stage of albinism is when a person that has the trait can have from red hair to light brown hair, and they're not as pale as a person with type 2 albinism. And there's also a stage 4, but I forgot what that consists of at the moment. Let's see. So Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, she goes way deeper than that in her book, The ISIS Papers. She goes into the basis of the white power structure, as I said. She goes into her beliefs of what racism really is, why it exists, and how it is perpetuated in Western civilization. I just want to share a little bit of her book so that you can get an idea about what her stand is on this issue. I advise you, if you can get your hands on an excerpt, or you can download it, or if you can buy it. I got her book from hpvmarketplace.com for like $5. Read it. It's good. It's a really good book. Let's see. She also goes into, this is funny, white inferiority, and how the Caucasian race they're insecure, and they really feel inferior, and they really feel like they are a minority. And she goes into this along the basis of, if you think about it, white people really can be considered the minority of the world, because you have the white race, and then you have the black race, then you have the Mexican race, then you have Indians, and then you have Asians, and Pacific Islanders, and all these different races that cover the earth. And white people are really the only people who don't have any melanin in their skin. They don't have any color. All the other races have some type of hue or pigmentation. So if you think about it that way, they really are the only race that are colorless. And you could be a little self-conscious about that, I guess. The world has been duped into believing that people of color are the minority races. But if you think about and look up the word minority, that means, the small group or minimal. If you have all these different nationalities and races of people, and all of them have color in their skin, and then you have the white race, this one race, and they don't have any color, I think they could be considered the minority group of the world. And Dr. Frances talks about that, and she also goes into, for that very reason, why racism exists is because the white race is terrified, apparently, of genetic annihilation, meaning that people of color, specifically black people, have the power to wipe them off of the earth, which is something that I find very interesting. I think I kind of agree with it, because what she's stating is that if you take a black woman or a black man and you pair them up with a white woman or a white man, and they have sexual intercourse and produce a child, the child will have color in their skin. It will be a person of color. And if that continues and continues, eventually everyone on the planet will have color. So Let me just go into her book really fast and just read a couple of paragraphs that I think are very, very interesting. So right now I'm in chapter 1 and this is page 4. By the way, let me just go ahead and say that I think her book is very profound, and without a doubt, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing is a very intelligent woman. This book has 22 chapters, I believe, and I'm only in chapter 4. And I'm like, yeah, this is an awesome book. So I can't wait to get to the back to see what else she has to say. Okay, so I'm starting right here, and she goes on to say, while Fuller is a person's name, she's making a reference here. While Fuller clearly suggests that this system consists of patterns of thought, speech, and action, practiced to various degrees by the majority of the world's white people, the only comment on etiology he makes is that, and she quotes him here, this person, Fuller, and he says, most white people hate black people. The reason that most white people hate black people is because whites are not black people. If you know this about white people, you need know little else. If you do not know this about white people, virtually all else that you know about them will only confuse you. And then she goes on to say, to take Fuller's account a step further, it should be noted that in the majority of instances, any neurotic drive for superiority usually is founded upon a deep and pervading sense of inadequacy and inferiority. Is it not true that white people represent, in numerical terms, a very small minority of the world's people? And more profoundly, is not white itself the very absence of any ability to produce color? I reason then that the quality of whiteness is indeed a genetic inadequacy or a relative genetic deficiency state based upon the genetic inability to produce the skin pigments of melanin, which is responsible for all skin color. The vast majority of the world's people are not so afflicted, which suggests that color is normal for human beings and color absence is abnormal. Additionally, this state of color absence acts always as a genetic recessive to the dominant genetic factor of color production. Color always annihilates the non-color, white. Black people possess the greatest color potential, with brown, red, and yellow peoples possessing lesser quantities respectively. This is the genetic and psychological basis for the Cress theory of color confrontation and racism, white supremacy. Okay, so that's pretty much, the basis of her book at first, I'll say. Page 5, let me go on and read something. This is still chapter 1, the next page. And let's see, where is she? Whites' desire to have colored skin can be observed at the first signs of spring and summer when they begin to strip off their clothes, as many pieces as the law will, often permitting their skins to be burned severely in an attempt to add some color to their pale bodies, and rendering themselves vulnerable to skin cancers in the process. Most cosmetics are also an attempt to add color to white skin. Such coloring makeup is provided for the white male as well as female. And finally, untold millions are spent annually on chemicals that are advertised as being able to increase the tanning potential of whites. The fact that some blacks have attempted to change the color of their skin to white does not mitigate the force of this argument, as it can be demonstrated readily that these non-whites are responding to the already established social conditions of white supremacy. Such a process, as seen in blacks and other non-whites, may be described as identification with the oppressor. Okay? Alright, and this is still chapter 1, page 9. She states, racism, white supremacy, having begun as a form of self-alienation, has evolved into the most highly refined form of alienation from others as well. The color confrontation theory views all the present battlegrounds in the world as vivid reflections of this reality. The destructive and aggressive behavioral patterns being displayed by white people towards all non-white peoples is evidence of the inner hate, hostility, and rejection they feel towards themselves, and of the depth of self-alienation and that has evolved from the genetic and psychological kernel of color inadequacy. Chapter 2, page 34. Okay, and she states here in the middle of the page, this is the reason that Valium is the most prescribed drug in the U.S., the key unit of Western civilization and culture. It is the same anxiety that causes Western civilization's preoccupation with weapons, spending more money on ornaments than on any other single budgetary item. These weapons surround all of the world's non-white peoples. The whites hope that the weapons will prevent white genetic annihilation and thereby ensure white genetic survival. But then whites hold the pervasive attendant fear that they will be destroyed in the conflagration also. This fundamental anxiety relative to global white genetic annihilation provides all patterns of symbols, logic, thought, speech, action, emotional response, and perception in all areas of people activity within Western culture and civilization. Also, it pervades all aspects of family life for whites and all non-white victims of white supremacy. And then I'll just read this last little part here. She goes on to say on page 44, in chapter 1, I explained that global behavior patterns of racism are a survival necessity for the white collective. This racist activity is a compensatory attempt to prevent white genetic annihilation on a planet where the vast majority of the peoples are genetically dominant to the melanin deficient whites. The awareness of self in the white global collective as a white genetic mutant population that was rejected by their black parents back in Africa, and the subsequent conscious and or unconscious determination to survive as a global minority became the underlying law that determined the evolution of the now global white supremacy system and culture. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I suggest that you get this book and you research albinism and you research Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. Something else that I came across recently that I found very, very interesting is that actually I heard this a couple of months ago. I don't know if this stuff is true or not. I've never seen statistics and facts laid in front of me. These are just things that I've come across and I've read. But what I've heard and what I've saw is that apparently the white or Caucasian race, they tend to have calcified pineal glands. Okay, that's something that they share that other races don't have. And what I discovered after receiving that information, what I discovered in Dr. Frances's book, is that calcified pineal glands are connected to psychotic behavior. So basically what she's saying is that the way that the white race behaves is not normal. It's not normal at all. Racism and just their personality altogether is just psychotic, and that is actually, she states in her book that it's like a mental disorder. So, surprise, surprise, nothing's wrong with the rest of the world. Something is seriously wrong with white people because they can't accept themselves as being the minority and they can't tell the truth, and so they do whatever they can to keep people of color of the world down and make sure that they stay on top. Very interesting. I love this book. I'm going to continue to read it tonight. And yeah, what do you think about that? The entire white race are mutant albinos, and they are the minorities of the world, and they fear genetic annihilation through integration and interracial sex.